The wind had teeth that morning. Daniel Hayes could feel them biting through the gaps in the window frame as he pressed his palm against the glass, watching frost spider across the surface like cracks in his resolve. Outside, the coastal town lay wrapped in December's bitter embrace, fishing boats bobbing like ghosts in the gray harbor, their masts cutting sharp lines against a sky the color of old pewter. Behind him, Emma's cough echoed through the cramped rental house, soft, persistent, like a prayer he couldn't answer. 7 years old and fighting a battle that made grown men weary, she lay curled on the threadbare couch, her small chest rising and falling with effort. The blankets Daniel had wrapped around her weren't enough. Nothing seemed to be enough anymore. "Dad?" Michael's voice cut through the morning quiet. At 10, his older son had learned to speak in whispers when Emma was sleeping, had learned too many things a boy shouldn't have to know. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ceiling's dripping again. Daniel turned from the window and saw it, a dark stain spreading across the kitchen ceiling like spilled coffee, droplets falling into the pot he'd placed beneath it 3 days ago. The steady plink, plink, plink had become the house's heartbeat, counting down to something Daniel didn't want to name. "I'll fix it," he said. Though they both knew his toolbox held more hope than proper equipment, duct tape and determination had been his currency for months now, ever since the layoffs at the docks had left him scrambling for work that paid in cash and asked no questions. He climbed the rickety ladder into the crawl space, flashlight between his teeth, and surveyed the damage. Water had found its way through shingles that should have been replaced before Sarah died, before the medical bills started arriving like hungry gulls, before everything good in their lives had been stripped away piece by piece. The beam of his flashlight caught something that made his stomach drop, rot spreading through the wood like a dark cancer. "It's okay, Daddy." Emma's voice drifted up through the floorboards, sweet and certain. "Mama used to say houses cry sometimes, but they stop when someone loves them enough." Daniel closed his eyes against the sting of memory. Sarah had always found magic in broken things, had made their small rental feel like a palace with nothing but thrift store furniture and boundless optimism. Now the house felt like what it was, a shell barely holding them together. Back downstairs, he found Michael crouched by the front door, his young face pressed against the frosted glass. "There's something moving by the trash cans," he whispered. Daniel looked out and saw it, a shadow with matted fur and ribs showing through a coat that had once been golden. The dog was small, maybe part terrier, with eyes that held the same desperate hope Daniel recognized in his own mirror. "He's hungry," Emma said, appearing beside them like a ghost in her oversized pajamas. Her breathing was labored, but her eyes were bright with the fever of compassion that seemed to burn stronger the sicker she got. "We can't," Daniel started, but Michael was already moving, slipping outside with a piece of toast clutched in his small fist. Through the window, Daniel watched his son kneel in the frozen grass, extending his hand to the stray. The dog approached cautiously, tail low but wagging, and accepted the offering with gentle teeth. Michael's face transformed, wearing the first real smile Daniel had seen in weeks. "Can we keep him?" Emma pressed her palm against the glass, her breath fogging the surface. "Please, Daddy, he needs us." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Need. They could barely keep themselves fed, could barely keep warm, could barely keep breathing, and his children wanted to save something else that was broken and abandoned. But as he watched Michael guide the dog toward their porch, something shifted in the boy's posture, shoulders straightening, chin lifting with purpose. For the first time in months, Michael looked like a child again instead of a soldier in a war he hadn't chosen. "His name is Rusty," Michael announced as he brought the dog inside, not asking permission, simply claiming the responsibility. The dog shook snow from his coat and immediately went to Emma, who giggled as a warm tongue kissed her cheek. Daniel started to object, started to explain about landlords and deposits and the 100 reasons they couldn't take on another mouth to feed. But then Emma's cough quieted for the first time all morning, and she curled up with Rusty's warmth against her chest, and Daniel's protests died in his throat. The knock on the door came at exactly the wrong moment, or perhaps it had been coming all along, inevitable as the tide. Daniel opened it to find Victor Langley's thin frame silhouetted against the gray morning, his expensive coat making him look like a vulture dressed for business. Hayes. The landlord's voice was flat, efficient. I assume you know why I'm here. Daniel's mouth went dry. Behind him he heard Emma's breathing hitch, heard Michael's whispered reassurance to Rusty. The dog growled low in his throat, sensing danger. Langley stepped forward, pressing a folded paper into Daniel's hands. 30 days. After that, I file for eviction. His eyes swept over the water-stained ceiling, the makeshift repairs, the family huddled together on the couch. This isn't a charity, Hayes, it's business. As the landlord's footsteps faded into the morning mist, Daniel stood in his doorway holding the notice that might as well have been a death sentence. 30 days to find money he didn't have, to save a home that was barely standing, to keep his family from joining the ranks of the invisible poor who drifted through coastal towns like human driftwood. But when he turned back inside, Emma was laughing, actually laughing, as Rusty performed some elaborate tail-chasing routine that had transformed their cramped living room into a theater of joy. And Michael was building a bed for the dog out of old towels, his face serious with the concentration of someone who finally had something to protect besides himself. Maybe they couldn't afford hope. But they couldn't afford to lose it either. The office building that housed Langley Properties stood like a monument to the town's divided soul, gleaming steel and glass rising above the weathered storefronts and fading paint of the working district. Daniel had walked past it 1,000 times in his years living here, but never imagined he'd be climbing its sterile steps as a supplicant, hat literally in hand. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded him painfully of Sarah, looked up as he approached. Mr. Hayes, Mr. Langley is expecting you. Her voice carried a softness that suggested she knew exactly what kind of meeting this would be. Victor Langley's office occupied a corner of the 3rd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the harbor where Daniel used to work. From up here, the fishing boats looked like toys. The docks where real people earned real livings reduced to a quaint backdrop for someone else's prosperity. Sit, Langley commanded without looking up from his computer screen. He was younger than Daniel had expected, maybe 40, with the soft build of a man who had never loaded cargo in a freezing rain or patched a roof with winter wind cutting through his jacket. Daniel remained standing. Mr. Langley, I appreciate you seeing me. Do you? Langley's fingers continued clicking across his keyboard, each keystroke sharp as falling ice. Because from where I sit, you've been avoiding me for 3 months. Avoiding my calls, avoiding my notices, avoiding your responsibilities as a tenant. My daughter's been sick. The words came out rougher than Daniel intended. The medical bills are not my problem. Langley finally looked up, his pale eyes holding all the warmth of January seawater. I have 47 properties in this town, Hayes. If I made exceptions for every sob story, I'd be bankrupt in 6 months. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks despite the air conditioning. It's not a sob story, it's my life, my children's lives. Your children. Langley leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. Yes, I've seen them. The boy who stares at me like I'm some kind of monster when I drive through the neighborhood. Very dramatic. The casual cruelty in his voice made Daniel's hands clench into fists. Michael's a good kid. He's just protective of his sister. Protective. How admirable. Langley opened a manila folder on his desk. Let me share some numbers with you, Hayes. You're $4,200 behind in rent. Add late fees and legal costs, and we're looking at nearly $6,000. When exactly did you plan to pay that? The number hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd known it was bad, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that kept him awake at 3 a.m. I can pay you something now. $500, and I can get more by $500, Langley laughed, a sound like breaking glass. That's not even 1 month's rent. What makes you think I want to play this game for another year while you struggle to catch up? Because we're human beings, the words tore out of Daniel's throat. Because my 7-year-old daughter has chronic asthma and needs a stable place to live. Because evicting us in winter might actually kill her. For a moment, something flickered across Langley's face. Not compassion exactly, but perhaps recognition of his own reflection in a mirror he didn't like looking into. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold efficiency that had built his real estate empire. I'm not running a charity, Hayes. I have investors, mortgages, obligations. Your situation is unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to solve. He slid the eviction papers across his desk. You have until January 15th. After that, the sheriff serves you, and you're out, in winter or not. Daniel stared at the papers, the legal language blurring before his eyes. January 15th was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to perform a miracle with empty pockets and a reputation that had been shredded along with his credit score. There has to be something. He heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. Some kind of payment plan. There is something. Langley stood and moved to his window, hands clasped behind his back. I have a property in Portland that needs renovation work. Hard labor, but it pays well. Interested? Daniel's heart jumped before his brain caught up. Portland? That's 5 hours away. 4.5 if you drive fast. Langley's smile was sharp as winter ice. 3 months of work. Enough to clear your debt and then some. Of course, you'd have to leave immediately. Today, actually, the contractor is expecting someone Monday morning. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Leave his children to chase a job that might or might not exist, might or might not pay what Langley claimed. Leave Emma when she needed him most. Leave Michael to carry burdens no 10-year-old should bear. I can't leave my kids. Then, I can't help you. Langley returned to his desk, already dismissing Daniel from his attention. Business is business, Hayes. Nothing personal. Outside in the cold afternoon air, Daniel walked slowly home through streets that felt different now. Not like a neighborhood where he belonged, but like a place he was already leaving. The eviction notice felt like lead in his jacket pocket, weighing him down with each step. He found Michael in their small backyard, teaching Rusty to sit. The dog was catching on quickly, tail wagging furiously each time he got it right. When Michael saw Daniel's face, his smile faded. What happened, Dad? Daniel wanted to lie, wanted to protect his son from one more weight pressing down on their family. But Michael was too smart for lies, had been living in the truth of their situation longer than Daniel wanted to admit. We have 3 weeks, he said simply. Michael's jaw tightened in a way that made him look far older than 10. 3 weeks until what? Until we have to leave. Rusty sensed the shift in mood and pressed against Michael's legs, offering what comfort a stray dog could give. Michael's hand found the dog's head automatically, but his eyes never left Daniel's face. Where will we go? It was the question Daniel had been avoiding, the one that made his chest tight with panic. Shelters didn't take pets. Hotels were expensive and temporary. His sister in Tampa had her own problems, and pride still warred with desperation in his chest. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I'll figure something out. I promise. That evening, as Emma slept fitfully on the couch with Rusty curled against her side, Daniel sat at their kitchen table surrounded by bills and bank statements and the arithmetic of impossible choices. No matter how he rearranged the numbers, they didn't add up to hope. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Callahan moving around her kitchen next door. The elderly widow had been their neighbor for 2 years, always ready with a kind word or a plate of cookies when Emma was having a bad day. Maybe she would know something, someone who might help. But as Daniel stared at the eviction notice one more time, pride and desperation continued their war in his chest. He'd been raised to stand on his own 2 feet, to work for what he had, to never ask for handouts. The problem was, his feet were slipping, and he was running out of ground to stand on. The knock on her door came just after sunrise, soft but insistent. Mrs. Callahan opened it to find Michael Hayes standing on her porch, still in his pajamas, his face streaked with tears he was trying hard not to shed. Michael, honey, what's wrong? It's Emma, he whispered, glancing back toward his house. She couldn't breathe right last night. Dad walked the floor with her for hours, and she's finally sleeping, but... His voice broke. Mrs. Callahan, we're going to lose our house. She pulled the boy inside, wrapping him in one of her late husband's cardigans that still hung by the door after 3 years. Michael was shivering, though whether from cold or fear, she couldn't tell. Tell me everything, she said, shuttling him at her kitchen table with a mug of hot cocoa that steamed like hope in the morning light. The story came out in pieces. The eviction notice, Daniel's meeting with Langley, the impossible debt that hung over them like a storm cloud. Mrs. Callahan listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her own cup, her eyes growing sadder with each detail. 3 weeks, she murmured when Michael finished. Oh, that man has ice water in his veins. Dad says he'll figure something out, but I can see it in his face. He's scared. Michael's voice was barely audible. Mrs. Callahan, what happens to families like us? Where do we go when there's nowhere left? The question hit her like a physical blow. In her 73 years, she'd seen too many families disappear from the neighborhood, swallowed up by circumstances beyond their control. Good people, working people, who simply couldn't hold on when the tide turned against them. Sometimes, she said carefully, help comes from places we don't expect. Like where? Mrs. Callahan was quiet for a long moment, staring out her kitchen window toward the hill that rose above the harbor. Up there, barely visible through the morning mist, stood the Avery estate, a grand old house with windows that caught the sunrise like watchful eyes. Michael, have you ever heard of Admiral Thomas Avery? The boy shook his head. He used to live here years ago. Grew up in this very neighborhood, actually, before he went off to serve his country. Navy man, saved lives, commanded respect, the kind of person who makes you proud to share the same air. She paused, remembering. He came back after he retired, bought the old Morrison place up on the hill. But something happened to him overseas. Lost his boy in the service, they say. Michael leaned forward, his eyes wide. His son died in Afghanistan about 5 years ago. Tommy Jr., named after his father. Sweetest child you ever saw, always helping his neighbors, always ready with a smile. Mrs. Callahan's voice grew soft with memory. After that, the Admiral just withdrew. Stopped coming to town meetings, stopped visiting folks, lives up there all alone in that big house looking out at the sea. But he's still there, still alive? Oh yes, I see him sometimes, driving through town in that old truck of his. Never stops, never speaks to anyone, just watching. Like he's looking for something he lost and can't quite remember where he left it. Michael was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Mrs. Callahan watched him think, saw the wheels turning behind his young eyes. Do you think he might help us? The question she'd been hoping he wouldn't ask. The one she'd been wrestling with herself since Daniel had first mentioned their troubles months ago. Thomas Avery had money. Everyone knew that. Admiral's pension, investments, the kind of resources that could solve Daniel's problems without even making a dent in his accounts. But he also had wounds, and wounded animals were unpredictable. I don't know, sweetheart. The Admiral is complicated. Grief does things to people, makes them build walls around their hearts. He might not even listen. But he might? Mrs. Callahan looked at this brave boy who was carrying burdens no child should bear, who was already thinking of ways to save his family, while most kids his age were worried about homework and video games. He might, she admitted. Though I wouldn't recommend just walking up to his door. The Admiral values his privacy. What if? Michael's voice grew thoughtful. What if someone explained it right? Made him understand that it's not about wanting money, it's about family. About taking care of people who can't take care of themselves? The hope in his voice was heartbreaking. Mrs. Callahan reached across the table and took his small hands in her weathered ones. Michael Hayes, you listen to me. You are not responsible for fixing this. Your father is a good man who's doing everything he can. This is not your battle to fight. But what if it could be? His eyes blazed with desperate determination. What if someone just needs to ask the right way? That afternoon, Mrs. Callahan found herself climbing the winding road that led to the Avery estate, carrying a casserole dish and a heart full of complicated feelings. She hadn't spoken to Thomas Avery in over a year, not since she'd tried to invite him to the church potluck, and he'd politely but firmly declined. The house still took her breath away, a sprawling Victorian that had been lovingly restored, its wraparound porch offering commanding views of the harbor below. But the windows were dark, the yard immaculate but somehow lifeless, like a museum exhibit of what home used to look like. She knocked on the front door, heard footsteps approach, and found herself face to face with a ghost. Thomas Avery had aged a decade in the 5 years since his son's death. His hair had gone completely white, his face lined with grief that had carved itself into permanent creases around his eyes. But he was still tall, still carried himself with the military bearing that had once commanded ships and men, still possessed the quiet authority that made people listen when he spoke. Mrs. Callahan, his voice was carefully neutral, this is unexpected. Admiral, she held up the casserole dish like a peace offering. I brought you some dinner, and I was hoping we could talk. Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the faint memory of what it felt like to have neighbors who cared. About what? She took a deep breath, thinking of Michael's tear-streaked face, of Emma struggling to breathe, of Daniel's proud shoulders bending under impossible weight. about a family that needs help, and about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. For a long moment they stood there looking at each other across the threshold, the widow who still believed in community and the Admiral who had forgotten what it felt like to belong to one. Then Thomas Avery stepped aside and let her in. The interior of the house was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Elegant furniture, polished floors, family photographs that stopped abruptly 5 years ago. But it felt hollow, like a shell that had been abandoned by everything that once gave it life. "You keep a lovely home," Mrs. Callahan said, settling into a chair that probably cost more than Daniel made in a month. "It keeps itself, mostly." Avery's smile was thin, the advantages of living alone. She studied his face, seeing the man he used to be buried beneath layers of protective ice. "Thomas, when was the last time you had company? Real company, not just delivery people or repair crews?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "I don't really. I prefer solitude these days." "Prefer it, or hide behind it?" His jaw tightened. "Mrs. Callahan, I appreciate the casserole, but if you've come here to psychoanalyze my life choices, I've come here to talk about a family in trouble. Daniel Hayes and his children. They're about to be evicted, and that little girl's illness makes it more than just inconvenient. It makes it dangerous." She watched his expression carefully, saw the flicker of interest he tried to suppress. "And you think this concerns me how?" "Because you used to be the kind of man who couldn't walk away from people in need. Because you took an oath to protect and serve, and I don't think that expired when you retired." Avery was quiet for a long time, staring out his window toward the harbor where fishing boats were returning with the day's catch. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking me to get involved in something that's none of my business. I'm asking you to remember who you used to be before grief convinced you that caring too much was what got you hurt." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Mrs. Callahan could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the man he used to be fighting against the walls he'd built to keep that man buried. "Even if I wanted to help," he said slowly, "throwing money at someone's problems isn't really helping, it's just enabling." "Who said anything about throwing money?" She leaned forward, pressing her advantage. "Thomas, that family doesn't need a handout. They need a hand up. Daniel Hayes is a proud man who's been knocked down by circumstances, not character. His children are good kids who deserve a chance." "And what exactly are you suggesting I do?" Mrs. Callahan smiled, recognizing the subtle shift in his question. Not whether he should help, but how. "Start by listening," she said. "Sometimes that's the most powerful thing a person can offer." As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Mrs. Callahan felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in weeks. She'd seen something flicker to life behind Thomas Avery's carefully guarded eyes, something that looked almost like purpose. Tomorrow she would tell Michael about her visit, but tonight she would pray that the Admiral remembered what it felt like to be needed, and that two broken families might help heal each other. Michael had been planning this mission for 3 days, ever since Mrs. Callahan told him about the Admiral. He'd mapped out the route, timing his departure for when Dad would be at his afternoon job cleaning the marina offices and Emma would be napping. He'd even practiced what he would say, standing in front of their cracked bathroom mirror and trying to sound older than his 10 years. But now, standing at the imposing iron gates of the Avery estate with Rusty panting beside him, all his careful words seemed to evaporate like morning mist. The house loomed above him through the bare winter trees. 3 stories of weathered shingles and gleaming windows that caught the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. A long driveway curved up through perfectly maintained grounds that made their own patchy yard look like a wasteland. Michael had never felt smaller or more out of place. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The intercom box beside the gate looked expensive and complicated. Michael stared at it for several minutes, gathering his courage, before pressing the button with a trembling finger. Static crackled for so long he thought no one would answer. Then a voice emerged, deep, measured, carrying the weight of authority even through the tinny speaker. "Yes? Admiral Avery, sir?" Michael's voice cracked embarrassingly. "My name is Michael Hayes. I live down in the harbor district, and I need to talk to you, please." Silence stretched between them. Michael could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Rusty pressing against his legs for comfort. "Son, this is private property. You shouldn't be here." "I know, sir. I'm sorry, but it's about my family. We're in trouble, and Mrs. Callahan said you used to help people, and I thought maybe—" The words tumbled out in a rush, desperation overriding his carefully rehearsed speech. Another long pause. Then the intercom clicked off. Michael's heart sank. He'd blown it. Just like everything else he'd tried to fix lately, this had failed too. He was turning to leave when the gates began to swing open with a low mechanical hum. A figure appeared at the top of the driveway, tall, straight-backed, walking with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. As Admiral Avery drew closer, Michael could see the details Mrs. Callahan had missed, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the careful way he held himself as if movement caused pain, the faded photograph clutched in one weathered hand. "You're the Hayes boy," Avery said when he reached the gate. It wasn't a question. "Your father works the docks." "Yes, sir. Well, he used to. Before the layoffs." Michael straightened his shoulders, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Sir, I know you don't know us, but we need help, and I didn't know who else to ask." Avery's gray eyes studied him with uncomfortable intensity. "And you thought approaching a stranger was appropriate?" "You're not a stranger, sir. Everyone in town knows about you. About what you did in the Navy. About—" Michael glanced at the photograph in Avery's hand. "About your son." Something shifted in the Admiral's expression, a tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible step backward. "You don't know anything about my son." "I know he died serving his country. I know you must miss him every day." Michael's voice grew steadier, drawing strength from the conviction in his words. "Mrs. Callahan says you used to help people before it happened. She says you cared about families like ours." Mrs. Callahan says too much. But there was no real anger in Avery's voice, just a weariness that made him seem older than his years. Rusty chose that moment to investigate the Admiral's boots, sniffing curiously before sitting and offering a tentative tail wag. Despite himself, Avery's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "This your dog?" "Sort of. He's a stray who adopted us. Dad says we can't afford to keep him, but Emma loves him, and she's—" Michael's voice caught. "She's really sick, sir. Has trouble breathing sometimes. The doctors say she needs to stay warm and stress-free. But our house is cold and falling apart, and Mr. Langley's going to evict us in 3 weeks." Avery's expression didn't change, but Michael noticed his grip tighten on the photograph. "Son, I'm sorry about your family situation, but—" "We're not asking for charity." The words burst out of Michael with surprising force. "Dad would never let me ask for money. But maybe you could talk to Mr. Langley? Everyone respects you. Maybe if he knew that someone like you cared about what happened to us." "Someone like me," Avery's voice was flat. "And what kind of person do you think I am?" Michael looked up at this man who stood like a lighthouse, solid, imposing, but somehow isolated from everything around him. "I think you're someone who knows what it's like to lose the people you love most. I think you understand that some fights are worth having, even when you're scared." The words hung in the cold air between them. Avery stared down at Michael with an expression the boy couldn't read, then glanced at the photograph in his hand. A young man in military dress uniform, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the world was full of possibilities. "You should go home," Avery said finally. "Your father will be worried." Disappointment crashed over Michael like a cold wave. He'd failed. Just like he'd failed to keep his mother from dying, failed to keep his father from losing his job, failed to keep his family from falling apart piece by piece. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, Rusty falling into step beside him. "Boy." Michael stopped, hope flickering back to life. "What's your sister's name?" "Emma. Emma Hayes. She's 7. Michael's voice grew soft with love. "She draws pictures of lighthouses. Says they help lost ships find their way home." Avery was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the harbor where the real lighthouse stood sentinel against the gathering dusk. "Wait here." The Admiral disappeared into his house, leaving Michael standing at the gate with his heart hammering against his ribs. Minutes passed. Enough time for doubt to creep back in, for the cold to seep through his jacket, for Rusty to grow restless and whine softly. Then Avery returned, carrying a small paper bag. "Soup," he said gruffly, pressing it into Michael's hands. "The kind that's good for respiratory problems. Tell your sister." Tell her lighthouses work both ways. They don't just guide ships home. They also let people on shore know there's still hope out there in the dark. Michael clutched the bag like it contained treasure. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. I haven't done anything. But as Michael walked home through the gathering twilight, Rusty trotting contentedly beside him, he carried more than soup in his hands. He carried the memory of pain flickering behind Admiral Avery's eyes. Pain that looked remarkably like his own father's grief, like his own fear of losing what little family he had left. Maybe the Admiral had said no to helping them directly, but he hadn't said no to everything. And sometimes, Michael thought as he climbed the steps to their rundown rental house, sometimes hope came in the smallest packages. Inside, Emma was awake and struggling to catch her breath, her small chest working too hard with each inhalation. But when Michael heated the soup and brought it to her, when he told her about the Admiral's message about lighthouses, her breathing seemed to ease just a little. He sounds lonely, Emma said between careful sips. Yeah, Michael agreed, thinking of that big empty house on the hill, of the photograph clutched in weathered hands. Maybe he is. That night, as Emma slept more peacefully than she had in days, and Dad counted the remaining money at the kitchen table, Michael stood at their window looking up toward the Avery estate. A single light glowed in one of the upper windows, steady, unchanging, like a lighthouse keeping its own vigil against the dark. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday night, rolling in from the Atlantic with the fury of winter unleashed. Daniel woke to the sound of wind screaming around the corners of their house, to rain hammering against windows that rattled in their frames like teeth chattering from cold. Emma's breathing was worse. He could hear it from across the small living room where she slept on the couch. Shallow, labored, punctuated by fits of coughing that shook her tiny frame. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours, and their struggling furnace couldn't keep up. Every breath she took seemed to cost her more than she could afford. Dad? Michael appeared in the hallway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The ceiling in my room is leaking again, bad this time. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and followed his son to the back bedroom. Water was streaming through multiple cracks in the ceiling, pooling on the floor and soaking into the cheap carpet that was already stained from previous leaks. The smell of mold hung heavy in the air, a smell that made his chest tight with worry for Emma's lungs. Get some pots, Daniel said, though they both knew it was like trying to catch the ocean with a teacup. The roof was failing, the house was dying around them, and he had 13 days left to work a miracle. As they worked in the dark, positioning containers under the worst leaks, Rusty huddled in the corner, whimpering at each crack of thunder. The dog had become Emma's constant companion, sleeping beside her, seeming to sense when her breathing grew labored and pressing close to offer what comfort he could. Maybe we should take Emma to the hospital, Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Daniel's hands stilled on the pot he was positioning. The emergency room would help her breathe, would warm her up, would keep her safe. It would also cost money they didn't have and raise questions about their living situation that he wasn't ready to answer. She's okay for now, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Let's just get through the night. But as the hours passed, Daniel found himself checking on Emma every few minutes, pressing his hand to her forehead to gauge her temperature, counting the seconds between breaths. The house groaned and settled around them, and with each gust of wind, more water found its way inside. By morning, their small home looked like a disaster zone. Pots and buckets scattered across every room, towels soaked and useless. The smell of damp and decay permeating everything. Emma's breathing had stabilized somewhat, but she remained pale and listless, curled under every blanket they owned while Rusty maintained his vigil beside her. Daniel was on his hands and knees in the kitchen, mopping up the latest influx of water, when he heard the knock at their door. He answered it to find Mrs. Callahan holding a thermos and wearing an expression of deep concern. Good Lord, Daniel, how bad is it? We're managing, he said automatically, then caught sight of his own reflection in her worried eyes. His hair was disheveled, his clothes soaked, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. No, you're not. She pushed past him gently, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had lived through her share of coastal storms. When she saw Emma's labored breathing, her expression grew grave. That child needs to be somewhere warm and dry. This is our home, Daniel said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Daniel Hayes, I've known you for 2 years, And in that time you've been nothing but proud and stubborn and determined to handle everything yourself. But this isn't about pride anymore. This is about Emma's life. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on keeping his family together that he'd lost sight of what that actually meant. Emma needed more than his determination and love. She needed warmth, dry air, safety, things their crumbling rental house couldn't provide. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted, the confession tearing out of him like a splinter. Mrs. Callahan set down her thermos and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Have you considered that maybe help doesn't always come from the direction you expect?" Before he could ask what she meant, another knock came at the door. Daniel opened it to find a figure silhouetted against the gray morning light. Tall, imposing, dressed in a heavy coat that spoke of quality and care. It took him a moment to recognize Admiral Thomas Avery. "Mr. Hayes." Avery's voice was formal but not unkind. "I believe we need to talk." Daniel's first instinct was to refuse, to protect his family's privacy behind the familiar shield of pride. But then he heard Emma cough from the living room, a sound that seemed to scrape against her lungs, and his defenses crumbled. "Come in," he said quietly. Avery entered their small home like a general surveying a battlefield, his trained eye taking in the water damage, the makeshift repairs, the obvious signs of a family under siege. When his gaze landed on Emma, something shifted in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of old pain newly awakened. "Your daughter," he said simply. "Emma," Daniel moved protectively toward the couch. "She has chronic asthma. The dampness makes it worse." Avery nodded slowly, his attention fixed on the small girl who was struggling to breathe under her pile of blankets. "How old?" 7. For a moment, the Admiral seemed lost in memory. Then he noticed the drawing taped to the wall beside Emma's makeshift bed, a child's rendering of a lighthouse, its beam cutting through stormy skies to guide ships safely home. "She drew that," Michael said from the hallway, where he'd been watching this unlikely meeting unfold. Avery studied the picture with the intensity of a man reading a military report. "It's good work, accurate proportions. She has an eye for detail." "She says lighthouses are hope with lights," Emma whispered from the couch, her voice thin but clear. "When people are lost, they help them find where they belong." The words seemed to hit Avery like a physical force. He stood very still for several seconds, staring at this sick child who spoke of hope and belonging with the wisdom of someone far older. "Mr. Hayes," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss your situation." They talked in the kitchen while Mrs. Callahan sat with Emma, the two men standing amid the evidence of Daniel's desperate attempts to hold his world together. Avery listened without judgment as Daniel explained about the layoffs, the medical bills, the impossible debt that had accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon. "Langley won't negotiate," Daniel finished. "It's business to him, just numbers on a spreadsheet." "Victor Langley." Something cold entered Avery's voice. "I'm familiar with his business practices." "You know him?" "I know his type. Men who mistake cruelty for strength, who confuse profit with purpose." Avery glanced toward the living room, where Emma was showing Mrs. Callahan her collection of lighthouse drawings. "Some battles can't be won with pride alone, Mr. Hayes. Sometimes you need better weapons. I'm not looking for charity." "Good, because I'm not offering it." Avery's gray eyes met Daniel's directly. "I'm offering partnership, a chance for both our families to heal something that's been broken too long." Daniel didn't understand what the Admiral meant about healing, didn't grasp the connection between his family's crisis and this wealthy, isolated man's pain. But he recognized something in Avery's voice, a quality he'd heard in his own words when Emma was struggling to breathe. The sound of someone who would do anything to protect what mattered most. "What kind of partnership?" Before Avery could answer, Emma's coughing fit echoed from the living room, followed by Mrs. Callahan's urgent voice calling for Daniel. Both men rushed to the couch where Emma was gasping for air, her lips tinged blue around the edges. Without hesitation, Avery scooped the small girl into his arms. "We're taking her to the hospital. Now." As they rushed toward Avery's truck through the aftermath of the storm, Daniel caught a glimpse of Emma's lighthouse drawing, still taped to the wall. a beacon of hope in their waterlogged home, promising that even in the darkest storms, there was always light to guide the lost towards safety. But as Emma struggled to breathe in the Admiral's arms, Daniel wondered if some ships sailed too far from shore to ever find their way back home. The emergency room at Mercy General moved with the controlled chaos Daniel remembered from Sarah's final months. Nurses in scrubs rushing between curtained alcoves, monitors beeping their electronic hymns, the smell of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against human fear and hope. Emma lay small and pale on the hospital bed, an oxygen mask covering half her face, her chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. "She's stable," Dr. Rodriguez assured Daniel for the third time in an hour. "The nebulizer treatment is helping, but she needs to stay overnight for observation." Her oxygen levels were dangerously low when you brought her in. Daniel nodded, though his hands shook as he signed the admission papers. Another night in the hospital meant another bill they couldn't afford. Another mark against a credit rating that was already in ruins. But Emma was breathing easier, her color returning to something that resembled healthy, and that was worth any amount of debt. "Dad?" Michael stood beside Emma's bed, holding Rusty's makeshift leash. The hospital staff had initially refused to allow the dog inside, but Admiral Avery had spoken quietly to someone in administration, and suddenly, exceptions were being made. "Is she going to be okay?" "She's gonna be fine," Daniel said, though the words felt like a prayer more than a promise. From his chair in the corner, Admiral Avery watched the family with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. The older man had been silent since they'd arrived, efficient and authoritative in dealing with hospital bureaucracy, but withdrawn when it came to personal interaction. He'd paid for the ambulance without being asked, had somehow bypassed the usual insurance verification process, had made things happen with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Why?" Daniel asked suddenly, the question that had been building pressure in his chest since Avery had lifted Emma from their flooded living room. "Why are you helping us?" Avery was quiet for so long Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Her picture, the lighthouse. My son used to draw pictures like that." Understanding began to dawn on Daniel like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. How old was he when he died? 26. But when he was Emma's age, he was... Avery pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn photograph. A young boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin, holding up a crayon drawing of a ship sailing toward a lighthouse. He was obsessed with lighthouses. Said they were magic, keeping sailors safe from storms. Michael moved closer to look at the picture. "He looks like he was nice." He was. Avery's voice cracked almost imperceptibly. He believed in helping people, in using whatever strength you had to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Right up until the end. Emma stirred on her hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open behind the oxygen mask. When she saw Admiral Avery, she tried to speak, but the mask muffled her words. "What's that, sweetheart?" Daniel leaned closer. Emma pulled the mask aside just long enough to whisper, "Thank you for helping us get to the lighthouse." The words hit Avery like a physical blow. His face went white, his hands trembling as he gripped the arms of his chair. "The lighthouse?" Daniel asked. "The hospital," Emma explained, her voice thin but clear. "It's where they fix people, like a lighthouse for broken bodies." Avery stood abruptly and walked to the window that looked out over the harbor. In the distance, the town's real lighthouse stood against the gray afternoon sky, its beacon dark in the daylight, but ready to shine when darkness fell. "I should go," he said suddenly. "You have everything you need here." "Admiral, wait," Daniel started. But Avery was already moving toward the door, his military bearing intact, but something broken in his stride. At the threshold, he paused without turning around. "There's a pharmacy down the street. They'll deliver whatever medication she needs. Tell them to put it on the Avery account." Then he was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the faint scent of salt air that seemed to follow him everywhere. That evening, as Emma slept peacefully with proper oxygen flow and Michael dozed in the visitor's chair with Rusty curled at his feet, Daniel found himself thinking about the Admiral's son. 26 years old, young enough to have his whole life ahead of him, old enough to understand the weight of duty and sacrifice. Lost in a war half a world away, leaving behind a father who had retreated into isolation like a lighthouse keeper tending a beacon that no one needed anymore. The pharmacy delivery arrived just after sunset. Not just Emma's rescue inhaler and antibiotics, but supplies Daniel hadn't even known to request. Pediatric nebulizer solutions, hypoallergenic blankets, even a small humidifier to help with her breathing once they returned home. If they still had a home to return to. The thought hit him like ice water. In the chaos of Emma's crisis, he'd forgotten about the eviction notice, about the 11 days they had left, about Victor Langley's ultimatum. The hospital was keeping Emma safe for now, but tomorrow they would discharge her to a house that was slowly drowning, to walls that leaked and floors that rotted beneath their feet. "Mr. Hayes?" A nurse appeared beside Emma's bed, carrying a clipboard and wearing the careful expression medical professionals used when delivering difficult news. "I need to speak with you about your daughter's discharge planning." Daniel's heart sank. Here it came. The questions about their living situation, the forms that would document their inadequate housing, the reports that might trigger visits from social services. "Her condition requires a stable, warm, dry environment," the nurse continued. "The attending physician has noted that her current respiratory distress was likely triggered by exposure to mold and dampness. We need to ensure she's returning to a safe environment. Our house is—" Daniel struggled for words that wouldn't sound like admissions of neglect. "We've had some water damage from the storm, but we're working on repairs." The nurse's expression grew gentler but more concerned. "Mr. Hayes, I understand that housing challenges aren't always within our control. But your daughter's health has to be the priority. If her current living situation isn't suitable for someone with chronic asthma, we have resources that might help." "What kind of resources?" "Temporary housing assistance, social services evaluation, possibly temporary foster placement while you address the housing issues." The words hit Daniel like hammer blows. Foster placement, temporary housing, social services evaluation. The careful language couldn't disguise what was really being discussed, the possibility of losing his children, of having his family torn apart by circumstances beyond his control. "That won't be necessary," he said firmly. "We'll figure something out." But as the nurse left them alone in the antiseptic quiet of the hospital room, Daniel felt the walls closing in around him. 11 days to find money he didn't have. 11 days to make their house habitable for a child who couldn't breathe in dampness and mold. 11 days to work a miracle that seemed more impossible with each passing hour. Outside the window, night was falling over the harbor, and somewhere up on the hill, Admiral Thomas Avery was sitting alone in his big empty house, looking at photographs of a son who would never come home. Two fathers, two families broken by loss and circumstance, separated by wealth and pride, but united by the fundamental truth that love alone wasn't always enough to keep the people you cared about safe. Emma stirred in her sleep, her breathing steady now with the help of medical intervention, but tomorrow the machines would be turned off, and she would have to breathe on her own again, in whatever shelter they could provide. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cold hospital window and wondered how many ships had been lost in sight of the lighthouse, close enough to see the beacon, but too damaged to reach the shore. 10 days. He had 10 days to save his family or watch them slip beneath the waves. The knock came at 6 a.m., 3 sharp raps that pulled Daniel from restless sleep on the hospital chair. Through the window, he could see Admiral Avery standing in the hallway, holding a toolbox that looked like it had seen decades of honest use, and a thermos that steamed in the cool morning air. "Admiral," Daniel stepped into the corridor, careful not to wake Emma and Michael. "What are you doing here?" "I've been thinking about your house." Avery's voice was gruff, but there was something different in his bearing, less rigid, more purposeful, about what needs to be done before Emma comes home. "Sir, we can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." Avery cut him off with the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions respected. "I have time, tools, and experience with emergency repairs. Your daughter needs a safe place to recover, and standing on pride won't fix a leaking roof." Daniel stared at this man who had appeared in their lives like an unexpected storm, bringing both disruption and the possibility of calm. "Why would you do this?" Avery was quiet for a moment, looking through the window at Emma's sleeping form. "Because 20 years ago, my son would have done it without question. Because some things matter more than keeping your distance from the world." 2 hours later, they stood in the Hayes family's water-damaged living room, surveying the destruction by harsh daylight. The storm had been even crueler than Daniel realized. ceiling tiles sagging, wallpaper peeling in long strips, the smell of mold thick enough to taste. No wonder Emma's breathing had deteriorated so badly. "This is worse than I thought," Avery said, but his tone was clinical rather than judgmental. "We need to get the water source stopped, tear out the damaged materials, and dry everything thoroughly before we can even think about repairs." "Admiral, this is going to cost." "Thomas." Avery was already pulling on work gloves. "If we're going to work together, call me Thomas. And don't worry about cost. Worry about doing the job right." They worked through the morning in companionable silence, tearing out water-damaged drywall and insulation. Thomas moved with the efficiency of someone who understood both urgency and precision, teaching Daniel techniques for salvaging what could be saved and identifying what had to go. "You know what you're doing," Daniel observed as Thomas expertly assessed the structural damage. "Navy Construction Battalion, before I went into command, you learned to fix things fast when you're building bases in hostile territory." Thomas paused in his work, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "My son used to say I was happiest when I had something to repair. Said I approached broken things like they were puzzles waiting to be solved." As they worked, Mrs. Callahan appeared with sandwiches and coffee, followed by other neighbors Daniel barely knew, the Hendersons from 2 houses down, old Mr. Petrosky who ran the corner market, even teenage Sarah Martinez, who babysat for families in the nicer part of town. Word had somehow spread that the Admiral was helping the Hayes family, and people were curious enough about this unprecedented event to offer their own assistance. "Haven't seen you around much lately, Admiral," Mr. Petrosky said as he helped carry damaged materials to the curb. "I've been keeping to myself." Thomas's response was neutral, but Daniel caught him watching the growing group of neighbors with something that might have been surprise. "Well, it's good to see you back in the thick of things," Mrs. Callahan said firmly. "This town's missed having you as part of it." By afternoon, the damaged areas had been stripped down to the studs. Industrial fans were drying out the remaining moisture, and someone had donated enough drywall and insulation to begin repairs. Thomas had somehow transformed their disaster zone into an organized work site, complete with proper safety measures and a logical sequence of repairs. "How did you know to do all this?" Daniel asked as they took a break on the front porch. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, watching Rusty chase leaves in their small yard. "After my son died, I threw myself into projects. Renovated every room in my house, built furniture I didn't need, repaired things that weren't broken. Took me 2 years to realize I was just trying to fix something that couldn't be repaired. Your grief. My purpose, my reason for getting up in the morning." Thomas pulled out the worn photograph of his son and studied it in the afternoon light. "Tommy always said the point of having strength was using it to help people who needed it. I forgot that for a while. And now? Now I'm remembering what it feels like to be needed for something that matters." That evening, when Daniel returned to the hospital with updates on the house repairs, he found Emma sitting up in bed, her breathing clear and her color healthy. Michael was showing her pictures he'd drawn of the neighborhood volunteers working on their house. Stick figures labeled Mr. P and Mrs. C and Admiral Thomas. "Dad!" Emma's voice was stronger than it had been in days. "Michael says the Admiral is fixing our house. Is it true?" "It's true, sweetheart. He's helping us make it safe and warm for when you come home." "I want to thank him," Emma said seriously. "Can I draw him a picture?" "I think he'd like that very much." As Emma worked on her drawing with the focused concentration of a 7-year-old artist, Michael pulled Daniel aside. "Dad, is the Admiral going to be okay? I mean, after we don't need help anymore?" The question caught Daniel off guard. In his relief at finding assistance for their immediate crisis, he hadn't considered what this temporary partnership might cost Thomas Avery, or what would happen when it ended. "What do you mean?" He seems sad. Not just regular sad, but deep down sad, like he's carrying something heavy all the time. "Mrs. Callahan says he's been alone since his son died. What happens when he's alone again?" Daniel looked at his 10-year-old son, marveling at the wisdom hidden behind worried eyes. Michael had seen something Daniel was only beginning to understand, that Thomas Avery needed their family as much as they needed him, that healing worked both ways, that sometimes the person offering rescue was the one drowning. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But maybe we can figure that out together." Emma finished her drawing and held it up proudly, a lighthouse with 2 beams of light instead of 1, illuminating ships sailing safely toward shore. In careful 7-year-old handwriting she had written, "For Admiral Thomas, thank you for helping our family find our way home." "It's beautiful, Em. He's going to love it." "The lighthouse has 2 lights because it's extra strong," Emma explained. "Like when people help each other, the light gets brighter." As Daniel settled into the hospital chair for another night of vigil, he thought about Emma's 2-beamed lighthouse and what it might mean. Perhaps healing wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about finding new ways to shine light into the darkness. Perhaps family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing to care for each other when the storms came. Outside the hospital window, night was falling over the harbor, and somewhere up on the hill, Thomas Avery was probably working late into the evening, driven by purpose he'd forgotten he could feel. Tomorrow Emma would come home to a house that was stronger than before, not just because of new drywall and proper insulation, but because it had been touched by the kind of care that transforms shelter into sanctuary. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were all going to find their way home. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be serving papers to a family whose story had become neighborhood legend. Daniel read it twice before the words fully registered: "Formal eviction proceedings. Court date January 20th. 4 days." Victor Langley had moved up the timeline, filing for immediate eviction while Emma was still recovering, and their house was mid-repair. The message was clear. No amount of community support or Admiral involvement would change the fundamental mathematics of unpaid rent. "He can't do this," Mrs. Callahan said when Daniel showed her the papers. "That child just got out of the hospital. There has to be some kind of humanitarian consideration." But Daniel had learned enough about landlord-tenant law during his desperate research to know that Langley was operating well within his rights. Compassion wasn't a legal requirement, and debt didn't disappear because of good intentions. Thomas found him that afternoon sitting on his newly repaired front porch, staring at the court papers like they might spontaneously combust. "How bad?" Thomas asked, settling onto the porch step beside him. "Complete eviction. He's asking the court to expedite because of property damage concerns and ongoing violation of lease terms." Daniel's voice was hollow. "He's going to argue that we're not fit tenants, that Emma's medical emergency proves we can't maintain safe living conditions." "And your defense?" "What defense? We owe the money, the house was damaged, everything he's saying is technically true." Daniel crumpled the papers in his fist. "I can't afford a lawyer, can't prove we'll be able to catch up on payments, can't even guarantee Emma won't have another medical crisis." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, watching Michael teach Rusty new tricks in their small yard. The boys' laughter carried on the afternoon air, a sound of pure joy that seemed to mock the legal documents threatening to destroy everything they'd built. "There's something you should know about Victor Langley," Thomas said finally, "about why he's pushing this so hard." "What do you mean?" "He's leveraged, overextended on his property investments, borrowed against future rental income to finance new acquisitions. He needs every dollar of rent to service his debts, which means he can't afford to carry non-paying tenants." Daniel looked at Thomas sharply. "How do you know that?" "I made some calls. Old Navy contacts who work in finance now. Langley's been refinancing properties, taking out second mortgages, playing a shell game with debt that's about to catch up with him." Thomas's smile was sharp as winter wind. "He's not evicting you because he's strong, he's doing it because he's desperate. That doesn't change anything, he still has the law on his side." "Does he?" Thomas stood, brushing dust off his work clothes. "Daniel, what would you say if I told you there might be another way to fight this? Not with money, but with truth?" Before Daniel could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway, moving carefully but under her own power for the first time since the hospital. She was carrying her newest drawing, the 2-beamed lighthouse she'd promised to give Thomas. "Admiral Thomas," she said formally, offering him the picture with both hands. "This is for you, for helping us when we were lost." Thomas accepted the drawing with the solemnity of someone receiving a military honor. His hands trembled slightly as he studied Emma's careful work, the lighthouse standing strong against stormy waves, its double beam cutting through darkness to guide ships safely home. "It's the most beautiful lighthouse I've ever seen," he said quietly. But why 2 lights instead of 1? Because when people help each other, the light gets stronger, Emma explained. 1 light is good, but 2 lights together can save more ships. Something shifted in Thomas's expression as he looked at this 7-year-old girl who spoke of light and rescue with the wisdom of someone who had been both lost and found. When he looked up at Daniel, his eyes held a determination that reminded Daniel of military commanders making battle decisions. "I'm going to that court hearing," Thomas announced. "Thomas, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." His voice carried the quiet authority Daniel had learned to recognize. "I'm going to tell them exactly what kind of family you are, what kind of man you are, and what this community thinks about landlords who try to profit from human suffering. It won't matter. This is about money and law, not character references." "Is it?" Thomas looked down at Emma's drawing again. "Because I think it's about what kind of community we want to be, whether we stand by and watch good families get destroyed by bureaucracy and greed, or whether we fight for what's right." That evening, as Daniel helped Emma with her breathing treatments and Michael finished his homework at their newly repaired kitchen table, he found himself thinking about Thomas's words. Fighting for what's right. It sounded noble, but Daniel had learned that righteousness was a luxury for people who could afford lawyers and time off work and the risk of making powerful enemies. But later, as he tucked Emma into her bed in their newly safe and dry house, she asked him a question that cut through all his practical concerns. "Daddy, what happens to lighthouses when storms come?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Do they turn off their lights when it gets scary? Or do they shine brighter?" Daniel thought about Admiral Thomas Avery, who had retreated into isolation after losing his son, who had turned off his own light for 5 years until a desperate family had reminded him what illumination was for. "They shine brighter," he told Emma. "That's when ships need them most." "Then we should shine brighter too," Emma said with the simple certainty of childhood. "Even if we're scared." As Daniel kissed his daughter goodnight and turned off her bedroom light, he realized that maybe Thomas was right. Maybe this wasn't just about unpaid rent and legal procedures. Maybe it was about what happened when a community decided to shine its light into the darkness, when people chose to stand together against the storms that threatened to tear families apart. 4 days until the court hearing. 4 days to prepare for a battle that would determine not just where his family would live, but who they would become in the process. Outside, the real lighthouse began its nightly vigil, its beams sweeping across the harbor in steady, reliable arcs. One light, standing alone against the darkness, guiding lost souls safely home. But tomorrow, Daniel thought, maybe that light wouldn't be alone anymore. The Coastal County Courthouse occupied a red brick building that had weathered a century of storms, both meteorological and human. Its imposing facade spoke of justice and permanence, but as Daniel climbed the granite steps on the morning of January 20th, he felt like David approaching Goliath with pockets full of hope instead of stones. Victor Langley was already inside, flanked by a lawyer whose expensive suit announced his competence as clearly as a military uniform declared rank. They stood near the plaintiff's table reviewing documents and speaking in the low, confident tones of people accustomed to winning. "Mr. Hayes," a bailiff approached. "Judge Morrison will see you in chambers before the hearing. Just you, please." Judge Eleanor Morrison was older than Daniel had expected, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that suggested she'd seen every variation of human folly the law allowed. Her chambers were lined with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of professional warmth that somehow made Daniel more nervous. "Mr. Hayes, I've reviewed your case file," she gestured for him to sit across from her massive oak desk. "I have to tell you, this is fairly straightforward from a legal standpoint. You're significantly behind on rent, and Mr. Langley has followed proper procedures for eviction." "Yes, ma'am, I understand that. What I don't understand is why Admiral Avery has requested to speak on your behalf. In my 20 years on this bench, I've never seen him in my courtroom. What's your relationship to him?" Daniel struggled to find words that would make sense to someone who dealt in facts and precedent. "He's been helping us. With repairs to our house, with my daughter's medical situation. I guess you could say he's become family." Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Family?" "Admiral Avery has lived as a recluse for 5 years. What changed?" "I think maybe we needed each other," Daniel said simply. "Sometimes people find family in unexpected places." The judge studied him for a long moment, then made a note in his file. "Well, Mr. Hayes, Admiral Avery's presence certainly adds an unusual element to what should be a routine proceeding. I'm curious to hear what he has to say. Back in the courtroom, Daniel found Thomas waiting in the gallery, dressed in his formal Navy uniform, crisp white with ribbons and decorations that spoke of decades of distinguished service. The sight of him in military dress was striking. Gone was the casual contractor who had repaired their house, replaced by an officer whose bearing commanded immediate respect. "Thomas," Daniel whispered as he took his seat, "you didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Thomas's voice was steady, but Daniel could see the tension in his jaw. "This uniform represents something your daughter understands better than most adults. It stands for protecting those who can't protect themselves." Mrs. Callahan had taken a seat in the front row, flanked by what appeared to be half the neighborhood. Mr. Petrosky was there, still wearing his market apron. The Henderson family had brought their teenage daughter. Even Sarah Martinez had skipped school to attend, her presence a quiet testimony to the impact the Hayes family had made on their community. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Eleanor Morrison presiding. Judge Morrison took her seat and surveyed the unusually crowded courtroom with interest. "This is eviction proceedings, case number 2025, EVO 847, Langley Properties v. Hayes. Mr. Brennan, you may proceed." Langley's lawyer was efficient and merciless. He presented the facts in stark legal language. 4 months of unpaid rent totaling $6,200. Property damage from inadequate maintenance. Medical emergencies that demonstrated the tenant's inability to provide safe housing for his children. Each point was documented, photographed, and presented with the cold precision of a medical examiner cataloging cause of death. "Your Honor," Brennan concluded, "this is a clear case of breach of lease. Mr. Hayes, despite our client's patience and multiple opportunities to remedy the situation, has demonstrated he cannot fulfill his obligations as a tenant. My client requests immediate eviction and damages." Judge Morrison turned to Daniel. "Mr. Hayes, do you have representation?" "No, ma'am. I'm representing myself." "And your response to the allegations?" Daniel stood on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom focused on him. "Your Honor, everything Mr. Brennan said is true. I do owe the money. Our house was damaged. My daughter did have a medical emergency." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But what he didn't tell you is why." For the next 10 minutes, Daniel told his story, not as legal defense, but as human truth. Sarah's death, the medical bills that devoured their savings, the layoffs that destroyed their stability, Emma's chronic illness that required constant vigilance and mounting expenses. He spoke of love and loss, of trying to hold a family together when everything seemed designed to tear them apart. "I'm not asking for charity, Your Honor. I'm asking for time. Time to catch up, time to rebuild, time to prove that good families can overcome bad circumstances when given a chance." When Daniel finished, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Mrs. Callahan quietly weeping in the front row. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Judge Morrison said gently. "Admiral Avery, I understand you wish to address the court?" Thomas rose with military precision, his uniform catching the afternoon light streaming through the courtroom windows. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded ships and men, who had made life-and-death decisions in the crucible of conflict. "Your Honor, I have served this country for 32 years. I have seen courage in many forms in many circumstances. But I have rarely witnessed the kind of quiet heroism I've observed in Daniel Hayes and his family." Thomas turned to face the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the assembled neighbors before settling on Emma, who was sitting between Michael and Mrs. Callahan. 5 years ago, I lost my son in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Thomas Avery Jr., killed in action while protecting civilians during a Taliban attack. After his death, I retreated from the world, convinced that caring too much was what had cost me everything I valued. His voice softened, the military bearing giving way to raw humanity. Then I met a 7-year-old girl who draws lighthouses, who speaks of hope and rescue with the wisdom of someone who understands that light exists to guide others safely home. Through Emma Hayes and her family, I remembered what my son tried to teach me before he died, that we have strength not for our own benefit, but to protect those who need protection. Thomas pulled Emma's drawing from his jacket pocket, unfolding it carefully. This is a lighthouse with 2 beams instead of 1. Emma told me that when people help each other, the light gets stronger. Your Honor, the Hayes family has lit something in this community that's been dark for too long. They've reminded us what it means to be neighbors, to be family, to be human. He turned back to Judge Morrison, his voice regaining its commanding strength. Mr. Langley has every legal right to pursue this eviction, but legal rights and moral obligations are not always the same thing. This community is asking you to consider what kind of precedent we set when we allow bureaucracy to triumph over humanity, when we choose profit over people. Thomas moved to stand beside Daniel at the defendant's table. Your Honor, I am prepared to guarantee Mr. Hayes' debt, to ensure his rent payments going forward, and to personally oversee any necessary property repairs. But more than that, I'm asking this court to recognize that sometimes healing, for families, for communities, for grieving fathers, requires mercy rather than judgment. The courtroom was absolutely silent when Thomas finished. Judge Morrison sat motionless for several minutes, studying the faces before her. The desperate father, the decorated veteran, the community that had rallied around a struggling family. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Langley, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In all your years of property management, have you ever, even once, accepted a payment plan from a tenant in crisis? Langley's face flushed red. Your Honor, business decisions can't be based on sentiment. That's not what I asked. Yes or no? Have you ever shown flexibility when circumstances warranted it? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Langley's lawyer whispered something in his ear. No, Your Honor, I have not. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Then let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to grant a stay of eviction for 90 days, during which time Mr. Hayes will develop a payment plan with Admiral Avery's assistance. If at the end of that period he can demonstrate good faith effort to remedy his debt, we'll discuss a longer-term solution. She looked directly at Langley, her expression stern. And Mr. Langley, I suggest you consider whether your business model serves this community's interests or merely your own. This court exists to serve justice, not just law. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Mrs. Callahan was openly weeping, the neighbors were embracing, and Emma was running toward the front of the courtroom to hug Admiral Thomas, who caught her up in his arms like she was his own granddaughter. Thank you, Daniel said to Thomas, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay. You don't repay family, Thomas replied, still holding Emma. You just love them and let them love you back. Outside the courthouse, as the winter sun broke through storm clouds that had been gathering all morning, Daniel realized that something fundamental had shifted. They had won more than a legal reprieve. They had found their way back to belonging, to community, to the truth that lighthouses work best when they shine together. 90 days to rebuild their lives. But looking at Emma's radiant smile and Thomas's transformed face, Daniel knew they had already found something more valuable than time. They had found their way home. 6 months later, the porch light still glowed every evening, but now it welcomed more than just the wind. Daniel stood in his doorway, coffee steaming in the April warmth, watching Thomas teach Michael proper knots on the front lawn, while Emma and Rusty supervised from their favorite spot under the oak tree that had weathered the winter storm and somehow grown stronger. The house around him bore a little resemblance to the water-damaged shell they'd almost lost. New shingles caught the morning sun, fresh paint gleamed white against repaired siding, and the windows no longer rattled when coastal winds picked up. But more than structural improvements, the home radiated something it had been missing since Sarah's death. The warmth of belonging, of safety, of a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Dad, Emma called from her perch against Rusty's golden flank. Admiral Thomas says he's going to teach me how lighthouses really work, the science part. Is that so? Daniel grinned at Thomas, who had developed the patient demeanor of a man rediscovering the joy of explaining the world to curious children. She's got an engineer's mind, Thomas said, straightening from the rope demonstration. Wants to understand the mechanics behind the magic. Reminds me of someone I used to know. The reference to his son came easier now, Daniel noticed. The photographs had reappeared throughout Thomas's house, and he spoke of Tommy Jr. with love rather than just loss. The healing hadn't erased the grief. Nothing could do that. But it had transformed the pain into something sustainable, something that honored memory without drowning in it. "Mrs. Callahan's here," Michael announced, pointing toward the elderly woman approaching with her characteristic purposeful stride and a covered dish that undoubtedly contained something delicious. She had become their family's unofficial grandmother, the bridge between their small unit and the broader community that had rallied around them during the crisis. Her kitchen served as neighborhood headquarters, her wisdom guided difficult decisions, and her endless supply of casseroles had kept them fed during the worst of their struggles. "Good morning, boys," she called cheerfully, "and good morning to my favorite lighthouse artist." Emma beamed at the greeting. Her latest drawing was taped to the refrigerator. Not a lighthouse this time, but a detailed sketch of their house with all its residents, Daniel, Michael, Thomas, herself, Rusty, and even Mrs. Callahan watering the flowers that now bloomed in boxes beneath their windows. "Holger, what's the occasion?" Daniel asked, accepting the warm dish. "Can't a neighbor bring breakfast to her family without an occasion?" Mrs. Callahan's eyes twinkled. "Though I did have some news to share." She glanced meaningfully at Thomas, who suddenly looked uncomfortable. "What kind of news?" Michael asked, his protective instincts still finely tuned after months of crisis. "The kind that involves a certain grumpy landlord finally getting his comeuppance," Mrs. Callahan said with satisfaction. "Victor Langley's properties went into foreclosure last week. Turns out Admiral Thomas wasn't the only one who did some research into his business practices." Daniel felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Langley could no longer threaten other families, but also a surprising measure of sympathy for a man whose desperation had made him cruel. "What happens to his tenants?" Daniel asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Thomas said, his expression carefully neutral. "The properties went up for auction. Someone bought the entire portfolio." "Who?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, then pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "Someone who believes that housing should be about providing homes, not just generating profit." The implications hit Daniel like a gentle wave. "Thomas, you didn't." "I did." His voice carried quiet conviction. "Turns out I had more money sitting around than one person needs, and this seemed like a better investment than government bonds." "But that's dozens of properties, hundreds of families." "Exactly." Thomas's smile was the first genuinely happy expression Daniel had seen from him. "Turns out there's no better antidote to grief than purpose. No better memorial to a son who died protecting people than spending your life protecting people." Emma had been listening with the intense focus she applied to adult conversations that seemed important. Now she stood and walked to Thomas, taking his weathered hand in her small one. "Your son would be proud," she said with 7-year-old solemnity. "Lighthouses are supposed to help people. That's what you're doing." Thomas knelt to Emma's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know what, Emma? I think he would be. And I think your mother would be proud of your father, too." The mention of Sarah no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Daniel felt the warm ache of love remembered, of a presence that lived on in the children she'd helped shape, and the values she'd instilled. "She always said our porch light was like a lighthouse," Daniel said quietly, "guiding lost souls home." "Maybe that's what we all are," Mrs. Callahan said, settling onto the porch step beside them. "Lighthouses for each other, shining light into the dark places, helping lost people find their way." As if summoned by their conversation, other figures began appearing in their yard. The Hendersons brought fresh muffins from their bakery. Mr. Petrosky arrived with vegetables from his garden. And Sarah Martinez stopped by on her way to school with homework questions for Michael, who had somehow become the neighborhood tutor for kids struggling with math. Their small front yard filled with the easy chatter of people who had become family through choice rather than blood. Rusty moved from person to person, accepting pets and treats with the dignity of a dog who knew he belonged. Emma showed off her latest drawings to anyone who would look, while Michael demonstrated the knots Thomas had taught him. "You know what I realized?" Daniel said to Thomas as they watched the impromptu gathering from the porch. "What's that?" "We spent so much time trying to save our house, but what we really needed was to save our home. And home isn't about the building. It's about the people who choose to be there when the storms come." Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them like shared light. "My house up on the hill used to feel like a mausoleum, a place where I went to be alone with my grief. But this," he gestured at the scene before them, Emma teaching Mrs. Callahan about proper lighthouse proportions, Michael showing Mr. Petrosky his knot-tying skills, neighbors laughing and sharing stories in the warm morning sun. This feels like what Tommy always talked about. This feels like home. Later that evening, as the last neighbors departed and the children settled into their bedtime routines, Daniel stood again in his doorway, hand on the porch light switch. For 7 years, this light had burned as a beacon of hope, a promise that love endures even when everything else fails. Tonight, he could see other lights beginning to glow throughout the neighborhood. Porch lights, window lights, the gentle illumination of families settling into safety. Up on the hill, Thomas's house blazed with warmth instead of isolation. Down the street, Mrs. Callahan's kitchen window glowed yellow with the promise of tomorrow's breakfast. Even the real lighthouse in the distance seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, its beams sweeping across waters that carried more hope than sorrow. Emma appeared beside him in her pajamas, Rusty padding along behind her. "Daddy, are you going to turn off the porch light now?" Daniel looked down at his daughter, healthy, happy, surrounded by love that had multiplied rather than diminished when shared with others. "What do you think, Em? Should we turn it off?" Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to all important questions. "I think," she said finally, "that lights are meant to stay on, so people know they're welcome, so they know someone's home." Daniel smiled, leaving his hand on the switch but making no move to flip it. "Then we'll leave it on, for as long as people need to find their way home." As father and daughter headed inside, the porch light continued its faithful vigil, no longer a solitary beacon in the darkness, but part of a constellation of lights that proved love, like illumination, grows stronger when shared. Outside, the harbor settled into peaceful evening quiet, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded, not a cry of distress, but a song of safe passage, guided home by lights that would never fade. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.